The Story of Civilization, Volume 2, The Life of Greece, Part 2, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 7, Side 2. Overreaching himself in the manner of his imaginative kind, he attempted in 169 to conquer Egypt. He was succeeding when Rome, herself a candidate for the Egyptian plum, ordered him to retire from African soil. Antiochus asked time to consider, but the Roman envoy, Popilius, drew a circle in the sand around Antiochus and bade him decide before stepping over its line. Antiochus yielded in fury, plundered the temple at Jerusalem to restore his treasury, sought glory like his father in a campaign against the eastern tribes, and died in Persia on the way of epilepsy, madness, or disease. 2. Seleucid civilization. The function of the Seleucid Empire in history was to give to the Near East that economic protection and order which Persia had provided before Alexander, and which Rome would restore after Caesar. Despite the wars, revolutions, spoliations, and corruption normal to human affairs, that function was performed. The Macedonian conquests broke down 1,000 barriers of government and speech, and invited the East and the West to fuller economic exchange. The result was a brilliant resurrection of Greek Asia. While division and strife, the poverty of the soil, and migrations of trade routes ruined the mainland, the comparative unity and peace preserved by the Seleucids encouraged agriculture, commerce, and industry. The Greek cities of Asia were no longer free to make revolutions or experiments. Homonoia, harmony, was enforced by the kings and was literally worshipped by the people as a god. Old cities like Miletus, Ephesus, and Smyrna had a second blooming. The valleys of the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Jordan, the Orontes, the Meander, the Halys, and the Oxus were fertile then beyond the conception of present imagination, obsessed with the vision of the deserts and rocky wastes that cover so much of the Near East after 2,000 years of erosion, deforestation, and neglectful tenant tillage. The soil was irrigated by a system of canals maintained under the supervision of the state. The land was owned by the king or his nobles or the cities or the temples or private individuals. In all cases, the labor was performed by serfs transmitted with the soil in bequest or sale. The government considered as national property all the riches contained in the earth, but did little to exploit them. Trades and even cities were now highly specialized. Miletus was a busy textile center. Antioch imported raw materials and turned them into finished goods. Some large factories manned with slaves achieved a modest degree of mass production for the general market. But domestic consumption lagged behind production. The people were so poor that no adequate home market encouraged large-scale industry. Commerce was the life of Hellenistic economy. It made the great fortunes, built the great cities, and employed a growing proportion of the expanding population. Money transactions now almost completely replaced the barter that had survived for 4 centuries, the coinage of Croesus. Egypt, Rhodes, Seleucia, Pergamum, and other governments issued currencies sufficiently stable and similar to facilitate international trade. Bankers provided public and private credit. Ships were larger, made 4 to 6 knots per hour, and shortened voyages by crossing the open sea. On land, the Seleucids developed and extended the great highways left as part of Persia's legacy to the east. Caravan routes converged from Inner Asia upon Seleucia and opened out thence to Damascus, Berytus or Beirut, and Antioch. Enriched by trade and enriching it in turn, populous centers rose there and at Babylon, Tyre, Tarsus, Xanthus, Rhodes, Halicarnassus, Miletus, Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Byzantium, Cyzicus, Apamea, Heraclea, Amissus, Sinope, Panticapaeum, Olbia, Lysimachia, Abydos, Thessalonica or Salonica, Chalcis, Delos, Corinth, Ambracia, Epidamnus or Durazzo, Taurus, Neapolis or Naples, Rome, Massalia, Emporium, Panormus or Palermo, Syracuse, Utica, Carthage, Cyrene, and Alexandria. One busy web of trade bound together Spain under Carthage and Rome, Carthage under Hamilcar, Syracuse under Hiram II, Rome under the Scipios, Macedonia under the Antigonids, Greece under the Leagues, Egypt under the Ptolemies, the Near East under the Seleucids, India under the Mauryas, and China under the Hans. The routes from China passed through Turkestan, Bactria, and Persia, or over the Aral, Caspian, and Black Seas. The routes from India passed through Afghanistan and Persia to Seleucia, or through Arabia and Petra to Jerusalem and Damascus, or across the Indian Ocean to Adana, or Aden, then through the Red Sea to Arsinoe or Suez, and thence to Alexandria. It was for control of the last two routes that the Seleucid and Ptolemaic dynasties fought those Syrian wars that finally weakened them both to the point of falling vassal to Rome. The Seleucid monarchy, inheriting the Asiatic tradition, was absolute. No assembly limited its power. The court was planned on the Oriental style, with chamberlains and lace, eunuchs and uniforms, incense and music. Only the speech and the inner dress remained Greek. The nobles were not half-independent chieftains, as in Macedonia or medieval Europe, but administrative or military appointees of the king. It was this structure of monarchy that passed down from Persia through the Seleucids and Sassanids to the Rome of Diocletian and the Byzantium of Constantine. Knowing that their power in an alien scene rested upon the loyalty of the Greek population, the Seleucid kings labored to restore the old Greek cities and to establish new ones. Seleucus I founded 9 Seleucias, 6 Antiochs, 5 Laodiceas, 3 Apamias, 1 Stratonice, and his successors imitated him to the best of their lesser ability. Cities grew and multiplied as in 19th century America. Through them, the Hellenization of Western Asia proceeded, on the surface, at a rapid pace. The process, of course, was old. It had begun with the Great Migration, and the Hellenistic dispersion was in part the Renaissance of Ionia, a return of Greek civilization to its early Asiatic homes. Even before Alexander, Greeks had held high offices in the Persian Empire, and Greek merchants had dominated the trade routes of the Nearer East. Now the opening of political, commercial, and artistic opportunities drew from Old Greece, Magna Graecia, and Sicily an emigrant flow of adventurers, settlers, scribes, soldiers, traders, doctors, scholars, and courtesans. Greek sculptors and engravers made statues and coins for Phoenician, Lycian, Carian, Cilician, Bactrian kings. Greek dancing girls became the rage of Asiatic ports. Sexual immorality took on a Greek grace, and Greek palestras and gymnasiums aroused in some Orientals an unwanted devotion to athletics and baths. Cities secured new water supplies and drainage systems. Avenues were paved and cleaned. Schools, libraries, and theaters stimulated reading and literature. Collegians, or ephoboy, and university students roamed the streets and played their ancient pranks upon one another and the populace. No one was counted cultured unless he understood Greek and could enjoy the plays of Menander and Euripides. This imposition of Greek civilization upon the Near East is one of the startling phenomena of ancient history. No change so swift and far-reaching has ever been seen in Asia. We know too little of its details and its results. We are poorly informed about the literature, philosophy, and science of Seleucid Asia. If we find in it few figures of prime magnitude, Zeno the Stoic, Seleucus the astronomer, and in the Roman period, Meleager the poet and Posidippus the polymath, we cannot be sure that there were not many more. It was a flourishing culture, full of variety, refinement, and verve, and as fertile in art as any preceding age. Never before, so far as our knowledge goes, had a civilization achieved so wide a spread and such complex unity amid so many diverse environments. For a century, Western Asia belonged to Europe. The way was prepared for the Pax Romana and the embracing synthesis of Christendom. But the East was not conquered. It was too deeply and anciently itself to yield its soul. The masses of the people continued to speak their native tongues, to pursue their long-accustomed ways, and to worship their ancestral gods. Beyond the Mediterranean coasts, the Greek veneer grew thin, and such Hellenic centers as Seleucia on the Tigris were Greek islands in an oriental sea. There was no such fusion of races and cultures as Alexander had dreamed of. There were Greeks and Greek civilization on the top, and a medley of Asiatic peoples and cultures underneath. The qualities of the Greek intellect made no entry into the Oriental mind. The energy and love of novelty, the zest for worldliness and the passion for perfection, the expressiveness and individualism of the Greek effected no change in the Oriental character. On the contrary, as time moved on, Eastern ways of thought and feeling surged up from below into the ruling Greeks, and through them flowed westward to transform the pagan world. In Babylon, the patient Semitic merchant and the temple banker regained ascendancy over the volatile Hellene, preserved the cuneiform writing, and forced back the Greek language into second place in the business world. Astrology and alchemy corrupted Greek astronomy and physics. Oriental monarchy proved more powerful than Greek democracy, and finally impressed its form upon the West. Greek kings and Roman emperors became gods in the manner of the East, and the Asiatic theory of the divine right of kings passed down through Rome and Constantinople into modern Europe. Through Zeno, the East insinuated its quietism and fatalism into Greek philosophy. Through 100 channels it poured its mysticism and its piety into the vacuum left by the decay of the Orthodox Greek faith. The Greek readily accepted the gods of the Orient as essentially identical with his own, but as the Greek did not really believe and the Asiatic did, the Oriental god survived while the Greek god died. Artemis of the Ephesians became again an Eastern maternity goddess with 12 breasts. Babylonian, Phoenician, and Syrian cults captured great numbers of the invading Hellenes. The Greeks offered the East philosophy, the East offered Greece religion. Religion won because philosophy was a luxury for the few, religion was a consolation for the many. In the rhythmic historic alternation of belief and unbelief, mysticism and naturalism, religion and science, religion returned to power because it recognized the secret helplessness and loneliness of man and gave him inspiration and poetry. A disillusioned, exploited, war-wearied world was glad to believe and hope again. The least expected and most profound effect of Alexander's conquest was the orientalization of the European soul. 3. Pergamum. The gradual absorption of the Greeks by Asia weakened the Seleucid power and generated independent kingdoms on the edge of the Hellenistic world. As early as 280, Armenia, Cappadocia, Pontus, and Bithynia set up their own monarchies, and soon the Greek cities of the Black Sea fell subject to Asiatic rule. Bactria and Sogdiana broke away about 250. In 247, Arsaces, chief of the Parnai, an Iranian nomad tribe, killed the Seleucid governor of Persia and set up the kingdom of Parthia, destined to plague Rome for centuries. In 282, Philoterus, entrusted by Lysimachus with the care of 9,000 talents and the fortified hill of Pergamum in Asia Minor, appropriated the money and declared his independence. His nephew Eumenes I absorbed Pitane and Aternius and made Pergamum a sovereign monarchy in 262. Attalus I earned the gratitude of Greek Asia by driving back the Gauls who had penetrated to his city walls in 230. His eldest son, Eumenes II, continued his competent rule, but shocked Greece by calling on the aid of Rome against Antiochus III. After their defeat of Antiochus at Magnesia, the Romans gave Eumenes nearly all of Asia Minor. His brother and successor, Attalus II, distrusted the power of his sons to keep Pergamum free, and at his death in 139 bequeathed his kingdom to Rome. The little state did what it could to redeem the treachery of its birth and growth by making itself the rival of Alexandria as a center of art and learning. The wealth that came from the mines, vines, and cornfields, from the manufacture of woolens, parchments, and perfumes, from the making of bricks and tiles, and the mastery of North Aegean trade, went not only to maintain a strong army and navy, but to encourage literature and art. The Pergamene kings believed that government and private business could fruitfully compete, supplying a mutual check on inefficiency and greed. The king cultivated large tracts of land with slaves and operated, though not as monopolies, many factories, quarries, and mines. Under this unique system, wealth increased and multiplied. Pergamum became an ornate capital, famous for its altar to Zeus, its luxurious palaces, its library and theater, its palestras and baths. Even its public lavatories upheld the municipal pride. The library was second only to Alexandria's in the number of its volumes and the repute of its scholars, and the Pinacotheca housed, for the public enjoyment, a great collection of paintings. For half a century, Pergamum was the finest flower of Hellenic civilization. Meanwhile, the house of Seleucus had fallen into decay. The rise of independent kingdoms almost confined its power to Mesopotamia and Syria. Parthia, Pergamum, Egypt, and Rome patiently labored to weaken the dynasty by supporting pretenders at every succession and fomenting faction and civil war. In 153, just as Demetrius I was restoring vigor to the Seleucid government, Rome collected mercenaries from every quarter to bolster up the false claims of a Smyrnian adventurer to the throne. Pergamum and Egypt joined in the attack, Demetrius fought and died heroically, and the Seleucid power fell into the hands of the worthless Alexander Belus, the puppet of his mistresses and of Rome. 4. Hellenism and the Jews. The history of Judea in the Hellenistic age turns on two conflicts: the external struggle between Seleucid Asia and Ptolemaic Egypt for Palestine, and the internal struggle between the Hellenic and the Hebraic ways of life. The first conflict is dead history and may be briefly dismissed. Matthew Arnold believed the second conflict to be one of the lasting cleavages of human feeling and thought. In the original division of Alexander's empire, Judea, that is Palestine south of Samaria, had been awarded to Ptolemy. The Seleucids never accepted this decision. They saw themselves separated from the Mediterranean and coveted the wealth that might come from the trade that passed through Damascus and Jerusalem. In the resultant wars, Ptolemy I won, and Judea remained subject to the Ptolemies for more than a century, from 312 to 198. It paid an annual tribute of 8,000 talents, but despite this burden, the land prospered. Judea was left a large measure of self-government under the hereditary high priest of Jerusalem and the Great Assembly. This Gerousia, or Council of Elders, which Ezra and Nehemiah had formed 2 centuries back, became both a Senate and a Supreme Court. Its 70 or more members were chosen from the heads of the leading families and from the most learned scholars, or sopherim, of the land. Its regulations, the Dibre Sopherim, set the pattern of Orthodox Judaism from the Hellenistic age to our own. The basis of Judaism was religion. The idea of a surveillant and upholding deity entered into every phase and moment of Jewish life. Morals and manners were ordained by the Gerousia in strictness and detail. Entertainments and games were few and restrained. Intermarriage with non-Jews was forbidden, so were celibacy and infanticide. Hence the Jews bred abundantly and reared all their children. Despite war and famine, their numbers grew throughout antiquity. Until the time of Caesar, there were some 7 million Jews in the Roman Empire. The bulk of the population before the Maccabean era was agricultural. The Jews were not yet a nation of traders. Even as late as the 1st century A.D., Josephus wrote, "We are not a commercial people." The great trading peoples of the age were the Phoenicians, the Arabs, and the Greeks. Slavery existed in Judea as elsewhere, but the class war was relatively mild. Art was undeveloped, only music flourished. The flute, the drum, the cymbal, the ram's horn or trumpet, the lyre, and the harp were used to accompany the single voice, the folk song, or the solemn religious antiphons. Jewish religion scorned the concessions of Greek ritual to popular imagination. It would have nothing to do with images, oracles, or birds' entrails. It was less anthropomorphic and superstitious, less colorful and joyful than the religion of the Greeks. Face to face with the naive polytheism of Hellenic cults, the rabbis chanted the sonorous refrain still heard in every Jewish synagogue. Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. Into this simple and Puritan life, the invading Greeks brought all the distractions and temptations of a refined and Epicurean civilization. Around Judea was a ring of Greek settlements and cities: Samaria, Neapolis, Gaza, Ascalon, Azotus, Joppa, Apollonia, Doris, Sycamina, Polis, and Acco. Just across the Jordan was a leagued decapolis of Greek cities: Damascus, Gadara, Gerasa, Dium, Philadelphia, Pella, Raphia, Hippo, Scythopolis, and Canetha. Each of these had Greek institutions and establishments: temples to Greek gods and goddesses, schools and academies, gymnasiums and palestras, and nude games. From such cities, and from Alexandria, Antioch, Delos, and Rhodes, Greeks and Jews came to Jerusalem, bringing the infection of a Hellenism devoted to science and philosophy, art and literature, beauty and pleasure, song and dance, drinking and feasting, athletics and courtesans and handsome boys, along with a gay sophistication that questioned all morals and an urbane skepticism that undermined all supernatural belief. How could Jewish youth resist these invitations to delight, this easy liberation from 1,000 irksome restraints? Young wits among the Jews began to laugh at the priests as money grubbers and at their pious followers as fools who allowed old age to come upon them without having ever known the pleasures, luxuries, and subtleties of life. Rich Jews were also won over, for they could afford to yield to temptation. Jews who sought appointment from Greek officials felt it the part of policy to speak the Greek language, to live in the Greek way, even to say a few kind words to the Greek gods. Against this powerful assault upon both the intellectual and the senses, 3 forces defended the Jews: the persecution under Antiochus IV, the protection of Rome, and the power and prestige of a law believed to be divinely revealed. Like antibodies gathering to attack an infection, the more religious among the Jews formed themselves into a sect called Hasidim, the pious. They began about 300 B.C. with a simple pledge to avoid wine for a given period. Later, by the inevitable psychology of war, they went to the extremes of Puritanism and frowned upon all physical pleasure as a surrender to Satan and the Greeks. The Greeks marveled at them and classified them with the strange gymnosophists or nude ascetic philosophers whom Alexander's army had come upon in India. Even the common Jew deprecated the severe religiosity of the Hasidim and sought for some middle way. Perhaps a compromise would have been reached had it not been for the attempt of Antiochus Epiphanes to force Hellenism upon Judea by persuasion of the sword. In 198, Antiochus III defeated Ptolemy V and made Judea a part of the Seleucid Empire. Tired of the Egyptian yoke, the Jews supported Antiochus and welcomed his capture of Jerusalem as a liberation. But his successor, Antiochus IV, thought of Judea as a source of revenue. He was planning great campaigns and needed funds. He ordered the Jews to pay in taxes 1/3 of their grain crops and 1/2 of the fruit of their trees. Ignoring the usual inheritance of the office, he appointed as high priest the sycophantic Jason, who represented the Hellenizing party in Jerusalem and sought permission to establish Greek institutions in Judea. Antiochus heard him gladly, for he was disturbed by the diversity and persistence of Oriental cults in Greek Asia, and dreamed of unifying his polyglot empire through one law and one faith. When Jason went about these matters with insufficient haste, Antiochus replaced him with Menelaus, who gave him larger promises and a fatter bribe. Under Menelaus, Yahweh was identified with Zeus, temple vessels were sold to raise funds, and in some Jewish communities sacrifices were offered to Hellenic deities. A gymnasium was opened in Jerusalem, and Jewish youths, even priests, took part naked in athletic games. Some young Jews, in the ardor of their Hellenism, underwent operations to remedy the physiological shortcomings that might reveal their race. Shocked by these developments and feeling their religion challenged in its very existence, the majority of the Jewish people went over to the side in view of the Hasidim. When Antiochus IV was expelled from Egypt by Popilius in 168, the news reached Jerusalem in the form of a report that he had been killed. The rejoicing Jews deposed his appointees, massacred the leaders of the Hellenizing party, and cleansed the temple of what they felt to be pagan abominations. Antiochus, not dead but humiliated, moneyless and convinced that the Jews had obstructed his campaign against Egypt and were conspiring to return Judea to the Ptolemies, marched up to Jerusalem, slaughtered Jews of either sex by the thousand, desecrated and looted the temple, appropriated for the royal coffers its golden altar, its vessels, and its treasuries, restored Menelaus to supreme power, and gave orders for the compulsory Hellenization of all Jews in 167. He commanded that the temple be rededicated as a shrine to Zeus, that a Greek altar be built over the old one, and that the usual sacrifices be replaced with a sacrifice of swine. He forbade the keeping of the Sabbath or the Jewish festivals, and made circumcision a capital crime. Throughout Judea the old religion and its rites were interdicted, and the Greek ritual was made compulsory on pain of death. Every Jew who refused to eat pork or who was found possessing the book of the law was to be jailed or killed, and the book, wherever found, was to be burned. Jerusalem itself was put to the flames, its walls were destroyed, and its Jewish population was sold into slavery. Foreign peoples were brought in to resettle the site, a new fortress was built upon Mount Zion, and a garrison of troops was left in it to rule the city in the name of the king. At times, it seems, Antiochus thought of establishing and requiring the worship of himself as a god. The orgy of persecution became intensified as it proceeded. There is always in any society a minority whose instincts rejoice in the permission to persecute. It is a release from civilization. The agents of Antiochus, having put an end to all visible expression of Judaism in Jerusalem, passed like a searching fire into the towns and villages. Everywhere they gave the people a choice between death and participation in Hellenic worship, which included the eating of sacrificial swine. All synagogues and Jewish schools were closed. Those who refused to work on the Sabbath were outlawed as rebels. On the day of the Bacchanalia, the Jews were compelled to deck themselves with ivy like the Greeks, to take part in the processions and to sing wild songs in honor of Dionysus. Many Jews conformed to the demands, waiting for the storm to pass. Many others fled into caves or mountain retreats, lived on clandestine gleanings from the fields, and resolutely carried on the ordinances of Jewish life. The Hasidim circulated among them, preaching courage and resistance. A detachment of royal troops, coming upon some caves in which thousands of Jews, men, women, and children, were hiding, ordered them to come forth. The Jews refused, and because it was the Sabbath, they would not move the stones that might have blocked the entrance to the caves. The soldiers attacked with fire and sword, killing many of the refugees and asphyxiating the remainder with smoke. Women who had circumcised their newborn sons were cast with their infants over the city walls to death. The Greeks were surprised to find the strength of the old faith. Not for centuries had they seen such loyalty to an idea. The stories of martyrdom went from mouth to mouth, filled books like the First and Second Maccabees, and gave to Christianity the prototypes of its martyrs and its martyrology. Judaism, which had been near assimilation, became intensified in religious and national consciousness and withdrew into a protective isolation. Among the Jews who in those days fled from Jerusalem were Mattathias, of the family of Hasmonai, of the tribe of Aaron, and his 5 sons, Johanan Caddis, Simon, Judas, Eleazar, and Jonathan. When Apelles, an agent of Antiochus, came to Modin, where these 6 had sought refuge, he summoned the inhabitants to repudiate the law and sacrifice to Zeus. The aged Mattathias came forward with his sons and said, "Even should all the people in the kingdom obey the order to depart from the faith of their fathers, I and my sons will abide by the covenant of our ancestors." As one of the Jews approached the altar to make the required sacrifice, Mattathias slew him, and slew also the king's commissioner. Then he said to the people, "Whoever is zealous for the law and wishes to support the covenant, let him follow me." Many of the villagers retired with him and his sons to the mountains of Ephraim, and there they were joined by a small band of young rebels, and by such of the Hasidim as were still alive. Soon afterward Mattathias died, having designated as captain of his band his son Judas, called Maccabee. Judas was a warrior whose courage equaled his piety. Before every battle he prayed like a saint, but in the hour of battle he was like a lion in his rage. The little army lived in the mountains after the manner of beasts, feeding on herbs. Every now and then it descended upon a neighboring village, killed backsliders, pulled down pagan altars, and what children soever they found uncircumcised, those they circumcised valiantly. These things being reported to Antiochus, he sent an army of Syrian Greeks to destroy the Maccabean force. Judas met them in the pass of Emmaus, and though the Greeks were trained mercenaries fully armed, and Judas's band was poorly armed and clad, the Jews won a complete victory, this in 166. Antiochus sent a larger force, whose general was so confident that he brought slave merchants with him to buy the Jews whom he expected to capture, and posted in the towns the prices that he would ask. Judas defeated these troops at Mizpah, and so decisively that Jerusalem fell into his hands without resistance. He removed all pagan altars and ornaments from the temple, cleansed and rededicated it, and restored the ancient service amid the acclaim of the returning Orthodox Jews. As the regent Lysias advanced with a new army to recapture the capital, the news came, this time true, that Antiochus was dead, this in 163. Desiring to be free for action elsewhere, Lysias offered the Jews full religious freedom on condition that they lay down their arms. The Hasidim consented, the Maccabeans refused. Judas announced that Judea, to be safe from further persecutions, must achieve political as well as religious liberty. Intoxicated with power, the Maccabeans now took their turn at persecution, pursuing the Hellenizing faction vengefully, not only in Jerusalem but in the cities that bordered the frontier. In 161, Judas defeated Nicanor at Edessa, and strengthened himself by making an alliance with Rome. But in the same year, fighting against great odds at Elassa, he was slain. His brother Jonathan carried on the war bravely, but was himself killed at Acco in 143. The only surviving brother, Simon, supported by Rome, won from Demetrius II in 142 an acknowledgment of Judean independence. By popular decree, Simon was appointed both high priest and general, and as these offices were made hereditary in his family, he became the founder of the Hasmonean dynasty. The first year of his reign was counted as the beginning of a new era, and an issue of coinage proclaimed the heroic rebirth of the Jewish state. Chapter 25. Egypt and the West. 1. The King's Register. The smallest but richest morsel of Alexander's legacy was allotted to the ablest and wisest of his generals. With characteristic loyalty, perhaps as a visible sanction of his authority, Ptolemy, son of Lagus, brought the body of the dead king to Memphis and had it entombed in a sarcophagus of gold. He brought with him also Alexander's occasional mistress Thais, married her, and had by her 2 sons. He was a plain, blunt soldier, capable both of generous feeling and of realistic thinking. While other inheritors of Alexander's realm spent half their lives in war and dreamed of undivided sovereignty, Ptolemy devoted himself to consolidating his position in an alien country and to promoting Egyptian agriculture, commerce, and industry. He built a great fleet and made Egypt as secure against naval attack as nature had made it almost unassailable by land. He helped Rhodes and the Leagues to preserve their independence of Macedon, and so won the title of Soter. Only when, after 18 years of labor, he had firmly organized the political and economic life of his new realm, did he call himself king, that in 305. Through him and his successor, Greek Egypt established its rule over Cyrene, Crete, the Cyclades, Cyprus, Syria, Palestine, Phoenicia, Samos, Lesbos, Samothrace, and the Hellespont. In his old age, he found time to write astonishingly truthful commentaries on his campaigns, and to establish about 290 the museum and library that were to make the fame of Alexandria. In 285, feeling his 82 years, he appointed his second son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, to the throne, yielded the government to him, and took his place as a subject in the young king's court. 2 years later he died. Already the fertile valley and delta had poured great wealth into the royal treasury. Ptolemy I, to give a dinner to his friends, had to borrow their silver and rugs. Ptolemy II spent $2,500,000 on the feast that climaxed his coronation. The new pharaoh was a convert to the philosophy of Cyrene, and was resolved to enjoy each monochronos hedone, every pleasure that the moment gave. He ate himself into obesity, tried a variety of mistresses, repudiated his wife, and finally married his sister Arsinoe. The new queen ruled the empire and managed its wars, while Ptolemy II reigned among the chefs and scholars of his court. Following and improving upon the example of his father, he invited to Alexandria as his guests famous poets, savants, critics, scientists, philosophers, and artists, and made his capital beautiful with architecture in the Greek style. During his long reign, Alexandria became the literary and scientific capital of the Mediterranean, and Alexandrian literature flourished as it would never do again. Nevertheless, Philadelphus was unhappy in his old age. His gout and his cares increased with the extent of his wealth and his power. Looking out from his palace window, he saw and envied a beggar who lay at ease in the sun on the harbor dunes, and he mourned, "Alas, that I was not born one of these." Haunted by the fear of death, he sought in the lore of Egyptian priests the magic elixir of eternal life. He had so enlarged and lavishly financed the museum and library that later history named him as their founder. In 307, Demetrius of Phalerum, expelled from Athens, had taken refuge in Egypt. 10 years later we find him at the court of Ptolemy I. It was he, apparently, who suggested to Ptolemy Soter that the capital and the dynasty might be made illustrious by establishing a museum, that is, a house of the muses, that is, of the arts and sciences, which would rival the universities of Athens. Inspired probably by Aristotle's industry in collecting and classifying books, knowledge, animals, plants, and constitutions, Demetrius appears to have recommended the erection of a group of buildings capable not only of sheltering a great collection of books, but also of housing scholars who would devote their lives to research. The plan appealed to the first two Ptolemies. Funds were provided, and the new university slowly took form near the royal palaces. There was a general mess hall where the scholars seemed to have had their meals. There was an exedra or lecture hall, a court, a cloister, a garden, an astronomical observatory, and the great library. The head of the entire institution was technically a priest, since it was formally dedicated to the muses as actual goddesses. Living in the museum were 4 groups of scholars: astronomers, writers, mathematicians, and physicians. All of these men were Greeks, and all received a salary from the royal treasury. Their function was not to teach, but to make researches, studies, and experiments. In later decades, as students multiplied about the museum, its members undertook to give lectures, but the museum remained to the end an institution for advanced studies rather than a university. It was, so far as we know, the first establishment ever set up by a state for the promotion of literature and science. It was the distinctive contribution of the Ptolemies and Alexandria to the history of civilization. Ptolemy Philadelphus died in 246 after a long and largely beneficent reign. Ptolemy III Euergetes, or well-doer, was another Thotmes III, intent on conquering the Near East. He took Sardis and Babylon, marched as far as India, and so effectually disorganized the Seleucid Empire that it crumbled at the touch of Rome. We shall not follow the record of his wars, for though there is drama in the details of strife, there is a dreary eternity in its causes and results. Such history becomes a menial attendance upon the vicissitudes of power, in which victories and defeats cancel one another into a resounding zero. Euergetes' young wife, Berenice, gave thanks for his successes by dedicating a lock of her hair to the gods. The poets celebrated the story, and the astronomers lauded her to the skies by naming one of the constellations Coma Berenices, Berenice's hair. Ptolemy IV, Philopater, so loved his father that he imitated his wars and his triumphs. But his victory over Antiochus III at Raphia in 217 had been won with native troops, their first use by any Ptolemy, and the Egyptians, now armed and conscious of their strength, began from this time onward to break down the authority of the Greeks on the Nile. Philopater gave himself to amusement, spent much time on his spacious pleasure boat, introduced the Bacchanalia into Egypt, and half persuaded himself that he was descended from Dionysus. In 205 his wife was killed by his mistress, and shortly afterward Philopater himself passed away. In the ensuing chaos, Philip V of Macedon and Antiochus III of Seleucia were about to dismember and absorb Egypt when Rome, with which the second Ptolemy had made a treaty of friendship, entered upon the scene, defeated Philip, sent Antiochus packing, and made Egypt a Roman protectorate in 205. 2. Socialism under the Ptolemies. By far the most interesting aspect of Ptolemaic Egypt is its extensive experiment in state socialism. Royal ownership of the land had long been a sacred custom in Egypt. The pharaoh, as king and god, had full right to the soil and all that it produced. The fellah was not a slave, but he could not leave his place without the permission of the government, and he was required to turn over the larger part of his crops to the state. The Ptolemies accepted this system and extended it by appropriating the great tracts which, under previous dynasties, had belonged to the Egyptian nobles or priests. A great bureaucracy of governmental overseers, supported by armed guards, managed all Egypt as a vast state farm. Nearly every peasant in Egypt was told by these officials what soil to till and what crops to grow. His labor and his animals could at any time be requisitioned by the state for mining, building, hunting, and the making of canals or roads. His harvest was gauged by state measurers, registered by the scribes, threshed on the royal threshing floor, and conveyed by a living chain of fellahs into the granaries of the king. There were exceptions to the system. The Ptolemies allowed the farmer to own his house and garden. They resigned the cities to private property, and they gave a right of leasehold to soldiers whose services were rewarded with land. But this leasehold was usually confined to areas which the owner agreed to devote to vineyards, orchards, or olive groves. It excluded the power of bequest and might at any time be cancelled by the king. As Greek energy and skill improved these kleroukic, or shareholders' lands, a demand arose for the right to transmit the property from father to son. In the 2nd century, such bequest was permitted by custom, but not by law. In the last century before Christ, it was recognized by law, and the usual evolution from common property to private property was complete. Doubtless, this system of socialism had been evolved because the conditions of tillage in Egypt required more cooperation, more unison of action in time and space than individual ownership could be expected to provide. The amount and character of the crops to be sown depended upon the extent of the annual inundation and the efficiency of irrigation and drainage. These matters naturally made for central control. Greek engineers in the employ of the government improved the ancient processes and applied a more scientific and intensive agriculture to the land. The ancient shaduf was replaced by the noria, a large wheel sometimes 40 feet in diameter, equipped with buckets hanging freely on the interior rim. At the top of the revolution, each bucket was tilted by an obstructing bar and emptied its contents into an irrigation reservoir. Better still, the screw of Archimedes and the pump of Ctesibius raised water with a speed unknown before the Ptolemies. The centralization of economic management in the hands of the government and the institution of forced labor made possible great public works of flood control, road construction, irrigation, and building, and prepared the way for the engineering feats of Rome. Ptolemy II drained Lake Moeris and turned its bed into a great tract of fertile land for distribution among the soldiers. In 285 he began to restore the canal from the Nile near Heliopolis to the Red Sea near Suez. Pharaoh Necho and Darius I had built and rebuilt this, but twice the shifting sands had choked it up, as in a century they would do again. Industry operated under similar conditions. The government not only owned the mines, but either worked them itself or appropriated the ore. The Ptolemies opened up valuable gold deposits in Nubia and had a stable gold coinage. They controlled the copper mines of Cyprus and Sinai. They had a monopoly of oil, derived not from the soil, but from plants like linseed, croton, and sesame. The government fixed each year the amount of land to be sown to such plants. It took the whole produce at its own price. It extracted the oil in state factories through great beam presses worked by serfs. It sold the oil to retailers at its own price and excluded foreign competition by a heavy tariff. Its profit ranged from 70 to 300%. Apparently there were similar governmental subsidies in salt, natron, or carbonate of soda used as soap, but they had to sell all their product to the state. Minor industries were left in private hands. The state merely licensed and supervised them, bought a large share of their output at fixed prices, and taxed a good part of the profits into the royal treasury. Handicrafts were carried on by ancient guilds, whose members were by tradition bound to their trade, their village, even to their domicile. Industry was well developed. Chariots, furniture, terracotta, carpets, cosmetics were produced in abundance. Glass-blowing and the weaving of linen were Alexandrian specialties. Invention was more advanced in Ptolemaic Egypt than in any economy before imperial Rome's. The screw chain, the wheel chain, the cam chain, the ratchet chain, the pulley chain, and the screw press were all in use, and the chemistry of dyes had progressed to the point of treating cloths with diverse reagents, which brought forth from immersion in one dye a variety of fast colors. In general, the factories of Alexandria were worked by slaves, whose low cost of maintenance enabled the Ptolemies to undersell in foreign trade the products of Greek handicraft. All commerce was controlled and regulated by the government. Retail traders were usually state agents distributing state goods. All caravan routes and waterways were owned by the state. Ptolemy II introduced the camel into Egypt and organized a camel post to the south. This carried only governmental communications, but these included nearly all the commercial correspondence of the country. The Nile was busy with passenger and freight traffic, apparently under private management subject to state regulation. For the Mediterranean trade, the Ptolemies built the largest commercial fleet of the time, with vessels of 300 tons burden. The warehouses of Alexandria invited world trade. Its double harbor was the envy of other cities. Its lighthouse was one of the 7 wonders. The fields, factories, and workshops of Egypt supplied a great surplus, which found markets as far east as China, as far south as Central Africa, as far north as Russia and the British Isles. Egyptian explorers sailed down to Zanzibar and Somaliland and told the world about the troglodytes who lived along the East African coast on seafood, ostriches, carrots, and roots. To break the Arab hold on Indian trade with the Near East, Egyptian ships sailed directly from the Nile to India. Under the wise encouragement of the Ptolemies, Alexandria became the leading port of reshipment for Eastern merchandise destined for the markets of the Mediterranean. This flowering of commerce and industry was quickened by excellent banking conveniences. Payment in kind survived to some degree as a legacy from ancient Egypt, and the grain of the royal treasuries was used as part of the bank reserve. But deposits, withdrawals, and transfers of grain might be made on paper instead of being physically performed. Beside this modified barter rose a complex money economy. Banking was a government monopoly, but its operations might be delegated to private firms. Bills were paid by drafts on bank balances, banks lent money at interest and paid the accounts of the royal treasury. The central bank at Alexandria had branches in all the important towns. Never in known history had agriculture, industry, commerce, and finance reached so rich, so unified, and so brutal a development. The masters and beneficiaries of this system were the free Greeks of the capital. At the head of all was the pharaoh god king. From the viewpoint of the Greek population, the Ptolemy was truly a soter, or savior, a Euergetes, or benefactor. He gave them 100,000 places in the bureaucracy, endless economic opportunities, unprecedented facilities for the life of the mind, and a wealthy court as the source and center of a luxurious social life. Nor was the king an incalculable despot. Egyptian tradition combined with Greek law to build up a system of legislation which borrowed from and improved upon the Athenian code in every respect except freedom. This book is continued on Cassette 8, Side 1.